We learned last time the definition of what an acid and a base is. An acid is a substance that releases hydrogen ions when it breaks apart or disassociates. A base is a chemical that releases OH, or what are known as hydroxide ions, when it breaks apart. So last time we gave you the example of hydrogen chloride, better known as hydrochloric acid, and we gave you the example of sodium hydroxide, also known as caustic soda or lye, the active ingredient in Drano. Now, on the pH scale is a way of numerically, using a number, and expressing the relative proportion of hydrogen ions or hydroxide ions in a solution. And it goes from 0 to 14. The midpoint between 0 and 14 is 7. And a solution that has a pH of 7 is said to be neutral. What does neutral mean? Neutral means that it has an equal number of hydrogen ions as hydroxide ions. An equal number, the same number. What's an example of a liquid that is neutral? Pure water. Because we pointed out that we could write water instead of H2O, we could write H2O, H-OH. And if a water molecule were to break apart, the way it breaks apart is it forms one hydrogen ion and one hydroxide ion. So the number of hydrogen and hydroxide ions are equal in number. Now, any solution with a pH lower than 7 is going to be increasingly acidic, having more and more hydrogen ions. Any solution with a pH number greater than 7 will be increasingly more basic or alkaline or caustic. We use all those terms interchangeably, meaning having a higher and higher concentration of hydroxide ions. We finished off last time looking at the pH scale on page C12. So let's take a look at page C12. So on page C12, this was just showing the pH scale. In this case, it was depicted vertically rather than horizontally. And right here we see pH 7. pH 7 being having an equal number of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. And an example of something with pH 7, as we've said, is pure water. Now, last time we talked about things that were acidic. And we mentioned that sour milk is a pH of 6. Even more acidic is coffee and tea. Even more acidic is beer. Even more acidic are carbonated drinks like Coca-Cola or Sprite, anything that's carbonated. We're going to be learning that's because beer and carbonated drinks contain carbonic acid. We'll learn what that is in a moment. Lemon juice, pH of 2, lime juice, pH of 1, and the fluid that's secreted by your stomach, which includes hydrochloric acid, pH of 1, and battery acid, you don't want to spill it on yourself, is approaching a pH of 0. Now in the opposite direction, I do want you to know that the normal pH of blood is 7.4. So blood and body fluids in general, because it says blood, sweat, and eggs, but it would probably also be tears, blood, sweat, and tears, would have a pH of 7.4. So it's not exactly 7. It's not exactly neutral. It's slightly on the alkaline or basic side, and I'd like you to know that. Just as some other things that are more basic or alkaline, containing even a higher proportion of hydroxide ions, would be chlorine bleach or Clorox. And even more alkaline or basic is ammonia. And you can see that ammonia is really, chemically, NH4OH. That's really ammonium hydroxide. Remember, the release of OH is what makes something basic. And you'll notice that both hair remover, which women may use on their legs, or oven cleaner, which you use to clean the oven, are both pH 13, very, very alkaline. I guess the lesson of that is that if you run out of hair remover, you could use oven cleaner. If you run out of oven cleaner, you could use hair remover, because they're both quite caustic or alkaline. Approaching a pH of 14 is pure sodium hydroxide. We've mentioned that last time. It's also known as lye. It's the active ingredient in Drano or liquid plumber. It's also known as caustic soda. Now, what I'd like to mention next is something called a neutralization reaction. A neutralization reaction. And the way that I'm going to present this is the experience that I was fortunate enough to have as a student a long time ago in college. So many years ago when I was a student in college, and I started out as a music major, as I may have mentioned before, I had a professor teaching a chemistry class, and I was taking a chemistry class, and they had 3 beakers in front of them. And one of the beakers was labeled HCl, which we know stands for hydrochloric acid. And another beaker was labeled NaOH, which we've learned last time means sodium hydroxide. Now this is a very strong acid, and this is a very strong base. Just to demonstrate how corrosive hydrochloric acid is, the professor took out a sheet of copper metal and poured some of the hydrochloric acid on this sheet of copper metal. And after pouring a little bit of hydrochloric acid on a sheet of copper metal, it started smoking. And within about 45 seconds, that hydrochloric acid had dissolved a hole right through a sheet of copper metal. So that sounds like something you don't want to put your hands into. Similarly, just to show how corrosive, how nasty sodium hydroxide is, which is the active ingredient in Drano, or liquid plumber, the professor similarly poured some sodium hydroxide onto a second sheet of copper metal. Again, it started bubbling and smoking, and again, within about 45 seconds, it had similarly dissolved a hole right through that copper metal. And then, what he did next is he took the hydrochloric acid that was still in the beaker, and he poured it into this middle beaker, and then he poured the sodium hydroxide into the middle beaker, and the whole thing started smoking. And the professor raised this middle beaker up to his mouth and took a sip of it, put it down on the desk, dropped to the floor. Yeah, we were waiting for him to appear, and we kind of had heard something called teacher burnout, and we figured maybe that's what had happened. But actually, after a few moments, he did stand up. You know, we're kind of waiting to see what's going on. We thought the guy had teacher burnout, had committed suicide in front of us. And he asked the following question. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, who would care to describe the chemical reaction that has just transpired?" And that's kind of the way professors used to speak in the old days. And so what did he actually drink? So as you can actually see, because I've already written it out for you, what he actually ended up drinking was salt water. And here's what happened. All right? He combined hydrochloric acid with sodium hydroxide. Now, when you combine chemicals and they mix and they remix up into something else, that's called a chemical reaction. They react. We represent a reaction by drawing an arrow. The arrow represents a chemical reaction. This particular chemical reaction is called a neutralization reaction. So what happens is this. The hydrogen in the hydrochloric acid combines with the OH in the sodium hydroxide. And what do you get when you combine an H and an OH? You get HOH, or water. And then the chlorine in the hydrochloric acid combined with the sodium and sodium hydroxide, forming what's sodium chloride? Salt. So all we actually ended up drinking was salt water. And this definition of a chemical reaction is just a rearrangement of the atoms. And I have to admit to you, I was so blown away by that that was one of several factors that actually got me really, really interested in science. I just thought that was the coolest thing I had ever seen. And I just imagined that somebody who knew about this, that you could take something that could dissolve through metal, 2 things that could dissolve through metal, and mix them and drink them, would have been viewed in the days of Merlin as a sorcerer. And a magician, a sorcerer, somebody who controls powers of the universe. And I thought, I want to know how to do that. That took a lot of chemistry after that, because I just thought that was amazing. This is called a neutralization reaction because, coming back to just plain salt water, It has an equal number of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions, so the whole solution in the end is neutral. Incidentally, if you're going to try this yourself, you got to absolutely make sure that the hydrogen ions in the hydrochloric acid perfectly balance the hydroxide ions in the sodium hydroxide. Otherwise, it won't be pH neutral or 7. Does everybody follow that? Now, we're mentioning a neutralization reaction, and right after that on page C12, so on C12 at the bottom, it mentions after neutralization reaction, it mentions the word buffer and buffer reaction. So now the question is, what is a buffer? A buffer, as I wrote, is a substance that minimizes pH changes. And you might say, well, what does that mean? A buffer is something, it's a chemical that makes something that's acidic less acidic, or something that's basic less basic. It doesn't necessarily neutralize, but it does reduce the excess acidity or alkalinity. And what I'd like to do as an example of a buffer reaction is to give you the following. Okay, so here's a buffer reaction. Okay, so I'll walk you through this. And I want to put this in a context, as you can see. I wrote HCl, that's hydrochloric acid, the same stuff we just talked about. And I want to put this in the context of somebody having a condition that you've all heard of called acid indigestion. Now, you'd say, now remember, your stomach secretes hydrochloric acid. Pretty tough acid. So let me explain how you can develop acid indigestion. Here's a good way to do it. Wait until about 12 midnight or later, and then order a 12-inch pizza with everything on it. Onions, bell pepper, everything, the whole works, right? And order everything on the pizza, and then have a few beers, and then immediately go to sleep. So what you've got is a full tummy filled with a whole bunch of, spicy foods. Your stomach starts secreting hydrochloric acid to digest the meal and so on. And then it starts coming up on you because you're lying horizontally in bed. And you'll after about a half hour, 40 minutes trying to sleep, you'll wake up going, oh my gosh, oh. All right, and we would say you're experiencing acid indigestion. All right, now, if you've got too much acid in your stomach, so based on what we've just told you with that neutralization reaction, you might say, I know what I'll do. I'll drink Drano. Now, it is true that Drano is sodium hydroxide, and that could, combining sodium hydroxide, mixing with the hydrochloric acid in your stomach, it should neutralize if you do it just right. Here's the problem. Before that sodium hydroxide, that Drano, reaches the hydrochloric acid, it'll dissolve right through your throat. You see the problem? So we can't go and we can't take, we've got too much acid in our stomach, we can't drink a strong base because it'll dissolve through our entire throat and esophagus before it makes it to the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. So we can't just try to neutralize. What we do instead is we use a buffer. Now a common buffer is sodium bicarbonate, NaHCO3. We've mentioned it before back on page C3. This sodium bicarbonate is the chemical that's in baking soda. And you can take some baking soda and just dissolve it in water. Now sodium bicarbonate is found in many other things. It's found in Alka-Seltzer and Bromo-Seltzer that people commonly might take for acid indigestion. And as we're going to see, it's also found in carbonated drinks. But let's say you take the sodium bicarbonate, which is called a buffer. So then what we're going to get, as represented by the arrow, is a rearrangement of the atoms. That's called a chemical reaction. So how are they going to rearrange? The sodium of the sodium bicarbonate will combine with the chlorine of the hydrochloric acid, forming salt. Okay, so far so good. The hydrogen in the hydrochloric acid will combine with the HCO3, which is called bicarbonate, and that forms H plus HCO3 forms H2CO3. Now you'd say, what's that? That's called carbonic acid. Now just stopping there for a moment, right? We'll get to what's written below it momentarily. So that's called a buffer reaction. Now you might ask, what good has that done? We had an acid, we've still got an acid. But we know that not all acids are equally strong. For example, while hydrochloric acid might be a really bad, very corrosive acid, we know there's citric acid in orange juice, right, which you can drink. So citric acid is not as acidic as hydrochloric acid. Well, so what the buffer reaction has done is we've gone from a very strong acid called hydrochloric acid to a weak acid called carbonic acid. This has a pH of maybe 1 or 0. This has a pH of maybe 4 or 3, you know, so 5 or 4, something like that. So it's not as acidic. So this is something you could swallow the sodium bicarbonate, and it would reduce the overall acidity in your tummy, reducing acid indigestion, all this strong hydrochloric acid. Interestingly, though, this reaction continues. Carbonic acid can then break apart, and when it breaks apart into carbon dioxide and water. You might say, really? Let's see. Let's just add this up. In carbonic acid, how many hydrogens are there? 2. How many hydrogens are written down here? 2 in the water. There's 1 carbon in carbonic acid. How many carbons are written down here? 1. There's 1 carbon. There are 3 oxygens in carbonic acid. What's the total number of oxygens written down here? 3. 2 oxygens here, a 3rd one there. So it all adds up, doesn't it? A carbonic acid can indeed break apart, forming carbon dioxide and water. So in fact, here's what happens when you have acid indigestion and you take some sodium bicarbonate or baking soda, right? It first breaks apart into salt and carbonic acid, and then the carbonic acid breaks apart into carbon dioxide and water. The carbon dioxide is a gas that makes you feel like you want to burp or belch. So you burp or belch carbon dioxide out your mouth, and after you've done that, all that's left in your stomach is salt water. So in fact, that's what happens. Now, this idea that carbonic acid can break apart into CO2 and water, or conversely, CO2 and water can combine into carbonic acid. So this is basically what happens in carbonated drinks. We had mentioned on page C12, carbonated drinks and carbonic acid. So what's actually going on in any carbonated drink is that there's carbonic acid in a carbonated drink. That's what makes them acidic. Not real acidic, but pretty acidic. And then what happens, let's say you have a Coca-Cola, Diet Coke, regular Coke, a Sprite. You open it up. Do you notice all the little bubbles of carbon dioxide coming out? The carbonic acid, the moment you open that can or bottle, it starts to break apart into CO2 and water, and you see all these bubbles of CO2 coming out. After all the CO2 has bubbled out, that means all the carbonic acid has broken apart and the CO2 has bubbled out. How does your Coke now taste? Flat. Because what gave it the bite was the acidity, the carbonic acid. And all the carbonic acid is broken apart into CO2 and water, and all the carbon dioxide bubbled out. So now it tastes flat. This is true not only with carbonated drinks, it's also true with beer. Because we wrote carbonated drinks are acidic, beer is acidic. It's got carbonic acid. When you open up a bottle or a can of beer, it also has all these bubbles of CO2 bubbling out. Again, that's the carbonic acid breaking apart. And after your beer sits for a while, my beer would never sit that long, I would have finished it, but after your beer sits for a while, it also will taste flat, right? Because it's the acidity that gives it its bite. What's another example of a carbonated drink? Champagne. So champagne also has all those bubbles of carbon dioxide. And after all the CO2 is bubbled out, it also will taste flat. So it's the acidity, the carbonic acid, that actually contributes to its flavor. So when all the carbonic acid breaks apart into CO2 and water, and the CO2 bubbles out, all you've got is basically sweet water, or just whatever was in there besides water. That's just the sweet water, beer, whatever, but it's all flat. Okay, let's summarize what we've been learning going back to page C4. So back on page C4, what about it?
If you are, if you go down the line of will you always get to seawater if you stay on,
No, it's just, those are just different pHs of different solutions.
Right.
Okay, let's, so we've talked about the pH scale, we've talked about a neutralization reaction, we've learned what a buffer is. Here we wrote a buffer is a substance that minimizes excess acidity or alkalinity, and we've given you an example of a buffer reaction. Now, the last thing I want to deal with as kind of we finish up our first year of chemistry is to explain what's the difference between an organic and an inorganic chemical or compound. What's the difference between organic and inorganic? So on page C4, let me start with what the definition is. What is the definition of an organic chemical? An organic chemical is also known as a hydrocarbon chemical because it's mostly made up of carbon and hydrogen. So organic and hydrocarbon mean the same thing. Now most organic compounds, most organic chemicals tend to be large and complex and high in energy. What are some examples of organic or hydrocarbon chemicals that tend to be large and complex and high in energy? The simplest organic compound, the simplest hydrocarbon or organic compound there is CH4, carbon and 4 hydrogens. What is CH4 called? It's called methane, as in methane gas. Methane or methane gas is what powers your gas stove. If you have a gas stove, what creates that flame is you're using methane as a fuel because it's high in energy. All organic compounds are high in energy. Your hot water heater uses gas. Natural gas is methane. That's the simplest organic molecule there is, the CH4, which is 5 atoms big. Here's one that's even larger, C6H12O6. What's that? That's a sugar called glucose. That's 24 atoms big. And even that is considered very, very small among organic compounds or hydrocarbon compounds. The point being, hydrocarbon compounds or organic compounds are very large, very complex, and always very high in energy. Now, if that's the definition of an organic chemical, that it's mostly made up of carbon and hydrogens, what's an inorganic compound? Right above. Inorganic compounds, we wrote, are generally small and simple and low in energy. Generally low in energy. So what are some examples of chemicals that are not organic? Now remember, in order to be an organic chemical, it has to contain both carbon and hydrogen. If it doesn't have both carbon and hydrogen, it is considered an inorganic chemical. So an example would be salt, NaCl. Salt has neither carbon nor hydrogen. Clearly, it's not a hydrocarbon organic chemical. And salt is only 2 atoms big. It's low in energy. You need salt in order to live, but you don't get energy by eating salt. You get energy by eating sugars. Another one, a chemical that we've talked about in this class is calcium sulfide. That was the one we asked you to draw a picture of that day. So again, that's 2 atoms big. It's very small, just 2 atoms big. It doesn't contain either carbon or hydrogen. Water is an inorganic compound. Even though water has hydrogens in it, it's not a hydrocarbon compound. It's got to have both carbon and hydrogen to be considered an organic chemical. Water is just 3 atoms big. We certainly need water. We're 60% water as a human by weight, but we don't get energy by drinking water. Okay? And even carbon dioxide is not an organic molecule. It's inorganic. You'd say, but it's got carbon. But is it a hydrocarbon chemical? No. It's got carbon, but it doesn't have carbon and hydrogen. So it's only 3 atoms big. It's low in energy and very small. Now, the most amazing thing I could tell you about organic versus inorganic is the following. On a periodic chart, and I'm just looking for my periodic chart. Yeah, on a periodic chart, what I'm about to say next is mind-blowing. You'd say, well, it doesn't take much to blow your mind, Professor Fink, but okay. All right, this is kind of mind-blowing. All right. If you counted all the different combinations of combining all these elements, remember previously we had learned that you could take any element in column 1 and combine it with any element in column 7 because they match up. So if you counted how many combinations you can make, and we learned that you can combine any element in column 2 with any element in column 6 and figure out all those. And then we mentioned other ways of combining, because you could take an element in column 2 and combine it with 2 elements in column 7. Remember that? Like calcium with 2 chlorines. If you added up all the possible ways of combining metals and nonmetals, all these different elements, there are less ways to combine them than what you can do with carbon-based chemicals alone, hydrocarbons. In other words, using carbon and hydrogen, mostly just carbon and hydrogen, you can create more combinations of chemicals than all the other combinations combined. It's hard to believe. Now, if you know about chemistry courses, not that you're necessarily taking a chemistry course, you may know that for science majors who have to take a lot of chemistry, the first year of chemistry is called Gen Chem, or General Chemistry. And basically, you learn a lot of the concepts that we were learning about, just in more detail. And you are also introduced to all these ways of combining these chemicals. The second year of chemistry is called Organic Chemistry, or Orgo. It is devoted strictly only to hydrocarbon chemicals. So in other words, that takes a whole year just to cover the chemicals you can create just using carbon and hydrogen. So how is that possible? What's why? What's so special about hydrocarbon compounds that there's so many ways to combine them? So we wrote back on page C4 that it really comes down to the unique properties of a carbon atom. And I want to remind you of where we first saw a picture of a carbon atom. It was page C7. This is page C7. And here's where we had a carbon atom pictured on page C7. So you'd say, okay, so what? What's so special about it? How many electrons are in the outer orbit of carbon? 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. It has 4 electrons in its outer orbit. Now we have learned atoms with less than 4 electrons in their outer orbit do what? They give them away. They're called metals. Atoms with more than 4 electrons in their outer orbit do what? They take. They're takers of electrons. They're called nonmetals. But I never really told you exactly what happens when an atom has exactly 4, when it's exactly halfway, like carbon. And what carbon always does is it shares. It always shares. It's not a giver. It doesn't give away those 4 electrons. It's not a taker. It doesn't take. It always shares its 4 electrons with other atoms, other carbon atoms. It shares them with hydrogen. It shares them with oxygen. It shares them with other atoms. So we could represent a carbon atom using a dot diagram. We could represent a carbon atom this way, because it's got 4 dots in its outer orbit. And you might remember us learning that anytime an atom is going to share an electron, we can draw a line. You'd say, I don't remember that. Well, we covered it on page C11. You might remember if 2 chlorines each share 1 electron, we drew a Cl with a line and a Cl. If 2 oxygens are each sharing 2 electrons, that's called a double covalent bond, represented by 2 lines. If 2 nitrogens are sharing not 1 or 2, but 3 electrons each, that's called a triple covalent bond, represented by 3 lines. Well, now we come to carbon. Carbon always forms 4 covalent bonds. It shares its 4 outer electrons with other atoms. What's really special about carbon is that in the case of chlorine or oxygen or nitrogen, they shared, but with only other atoms just like them. Carbon not only shares with other carbon atoms, but tends to share with all other atoms. I don't want to get metaphysical here, but isn't it interesting that life is based on carbon or hydrocarbon molecules? And the essence of carbon is to share. So life and living things are based at the chemical level on the concept of sharing. Kind of interesting. Not giving or taking, but sharing. That's the essence of it. So from now on, whenever we draw a carbon atom, since we now know that it always shares its 4 outer electrons, we will always draw 4 lines coming off each carbon atom. That's how it's represented. So I wrote this on page C4. On C4 we wrote on C4, carbon always forms 4 covalent chemical bonds. Covalent means to share electrons with carbon and with other atoms. Now the carbon atoms can be joined together into straight chains, branching chains, or rings. And you might say, what do you mean? So we can have carbon atoms where they just, and you don't have to worry about it, I'm going to show you pictures in just a moment of stuff like this. This just shows a whole bunch of carbon atoms with hydrogens attached, and any carbon atom I circle, you'll notice it's got 4 lines coming off it. These carbon atoms can even be looped into ring shapes. They're like tinker toys. The only rule that we need to follow when we're dealing with hydrocarbon compounds is that there has to be 4 lines coming off each carbon. So here, just as an example, don't worry, you don't have to draw these. I just drew 2 carbon atoms. In this case, they're each sharing 2 electrons with each other, and they're also, each carbon is sharing the other 2 electrons with hydrogens. Notice I've circled this carbon, and so how many lines are coming off this carbon? 4. How many lines are coming off this carbon? 4. That's the only rule we have to follow. They're like tinker toys, and you can build them into any shape or pattern you want as long as there's always 4 bonds or lines coming off it. Here's another example where we've got 2 carbons each sharing 3 electrons with each other, and they just have 1 hydrogen attached. You can shape these into triangle shapes. You can shape them into 5-sided pentagon shapes. In other words, you can construct them into any kind of conceivable shape you'd imagine. This is the magic of carbon chemistry. Carbon and hydrocarbon chemicals are the chemicals that make up the molecules of living things. Now, to help you understand this just a little bit better, we said we had pictures. So what I'd first like to show you is, right here we wrote simple straight chain hydrocarbon compounds. See page C13. So let's look on page C13. Okay, this is page C13, and you can see there's pictures already drawn here. All right, so these are like tinker toys. We've kind of given you a sense of how they work. All right, so the very simplest organic or hydrocarbon compound there is methane, also known as natural gas. As you look at it, right, it's just 1 carbon, and it's sharing its 4 electrons with 4 different hydrogens. Again, it always shares. Now, here it shows a slightly bigger molecule called ethane. You don't need to know the name ethane. Methane you've heard of, it's natural gas. That one you should know. Don't worry about ethane. Ethane is 2 carbon atoms big, but remember the rule. Carbon coming off every carbon atom are 4 lines. And that's to represent it sharing its 4 outer electrons. In this case, it's sharing 1 of its electrons with a carbon, and the other 3 with other hydrogens. Now, these can get longer. This is propane. Most of you have heard of propane. Propane is used, it's a fuel that's used to power your barbecue grills, right? All of these organic compounds contain stored energy. They all do. When you break these molecules apart, when you break these strong covalent bonds, they release energy. What's holding these atoms together are these strong sharing of electron relationships. That's a strong relationship. It's based on sharing. Now, remember, the weak bonds were the ones that were just an attraction between opposites, and you threw cold water on them and they broke it apart. That was an ionic relationship, an ionic bond. Now, here's one that's 4 carbon atoms long. It's butane. Butane is the fuel that's used for a cigarette lighter, a butane lighter. Again, no matter which carbon atom I circle, you'll see 4 lines coming off it. Then it shows one with 5 carbons, that's pentane. 6 carbons, hexane. 7 carbons, heptane. 8 carbons, octane. You've heard of that, it's in gasoline. Haven't you heard about the octane rating of the gasoline that you use to power your car? Now, this is showing a hydrocarbon organic molecule that's 8 carbons big. Do you think that's as big as they get? How big do you think they can get? There's no limit. It could be 100 million carbon atoms long. There is absolutely no limit to how big these can get. So you start to get a sense of just how many different types of hydrocarbon or organic molecules there are. Now, let's mention something else. Back on page C4, and we're going to go right back to C13 momentarily. So we've shown you what are called simple straight-chain hydrocarbon compounds. Let's show you what alcohols are. Now, we've all heard of alcohol. All right, the definition of an alcohol is that it's a hydrocarbon compound. It's an organic compound with an OH group attached. You'd say, what do you mean? So let's go back to C13 and look at the very bottom. Now, on the very bottom, I think I wrote out the word methanol at the bottom, right? And I wrote the word ethanol. So here I've drawn a methanol. Now let me walk you through what I drew. You'd say, yeah, explain, what did you do? I have a carbon atom. You'd say, okay, I can draw that. And coming off every carbon atom, there are 4 lines. Remember that? So it has, it's sharing one of its covalent bonds or electrons with this hydrogen, a second with this hydrogen, a third with this hydrogen, and here an OH. The moment we put an OH onto a carbon atom, that's called an alcohol. What would we call this alcohol? Methanol. You'd say, why? Let's just look right above. What was the very first chemical up here? Methane. Can you see that all that we've done is we substituted one of these H's with an OH? And it changes methane into methanol. Now, if it looked like this was called ethane. So let's put an OH in place of one of these hydrogens. So down below, can everybody see? Here's the 2 carbons. Here's hydrogens, right? But can everybody see that the only thing drawn differently from this molecule, from ethane, is I put an OH here. That's called ethanol. Ethanol. You know ethanol better as booze, as scotch, as vodka. That's ethanol. Now, you'll notice then that, just going back up here, so if you had methane and you substituted an OH, it went from methane to methanol. If you took ethane and you put an OH in place of one of these hydrogens, that's ethanol. If you had propane and you substituted an H, you'd get, anybody want to guess what it's called? Propanol. If you had butane and you substituted one of these hydrogens with an OH, it would be butanol. Now, that doesn't mean, what that means is there's not just one alcohol, there's an infinite number of alcohols. Everybody's going, my gosh, I can search the universe and drink different kinds of alcohols. Unfortunately, almost all the alcohols are quite toxic. Even the one we commonly drink, ethanol, is toxic if you drink enough of it. We know that drinking a lot of ethanol or scotch or vodka damages brain cells and damages liver cells. But it's nice in the process of seeing how much damage you can do, how good you feel. But The point is, there's an infinite number of alcohols because there's an infinite number of organic molecules that you can replace and just put an OH there.
So how do you write that? Is it COH4?
It's just always just put an OH on one side.
No, I know, but like, how do you write the compound out?
Well, we're not worried about that. See me after class. Okay? So, so we have been back on page C4. Back on page C4. So we were talking about, we've given you examples of straight chain hydrocarbon compounds and alcohols. How did we define an alcohol? It has an OH group attached, a hydroxyl group. And there's not just one alcohol, there's methyl or wood alcohol, also known as methanol. And they use that, as many of you know, to power vehicles nowadays. Methanol, you've heard of methanol, as a fuel. There is grain alcohol, or ethanol, that's the one we drink. Ethylene glycol, glycerol. In fact, if it ends in OL, it is an alcohol. Now, let's show you some other types of organic compounds. So I skipped right here, letter C, aromatic hydrocarbon compounds, or benzene ring. And these are shown on page C14. So let's look at that on page C14. So on page C14, these are called aromatic hydrocarbons. The reason why they're called aromatic is because they have a smell or an aroma in most cases. Now, what does an aromatic hydrocarbon look like? It has this shape. It's basically 6 carbon atoms looped together into a 6-sided ring. You'll notice that the carbons are alternating, where these two are sharing 2 electrons with each other, the next 2 share 1 electron with the other, the next 2 share 2 electrons with the other, the next one 1 electron, the next 2, 2. So it just alternates. But remember the rule. Coming off every carbon atom, there have to be 4 lines. It always shares its 4 outer electrons with other atoms, either other carbons, hydrogens, or other atoms. Again, it's amazing. Carbon is built on sharing. So whatever carbon atom I circle, doesn't matter which one you circle, there will be 4 lines coming off it. Now, since we know this, incidentally, the name of this particular aromatic hydrocarbon, the name of it is called benzene. Now, benzene is found in gasoline, and it is known to cause cancer. Anything that is known to cause cancer is said to be carcinogenic. It causes cancer. So actually, when you fill your car up with gas, you'll actually see that on the pump it has a warning label where it says the state of California has found that this can cause cancer or reproductive harm. Okay, people kind of ignore all these warning labels. Now, you're not supposed to drink gasoline, and ideally you're really not supposed to sit there and snort the vapors either. All right? They could remove the benzene, which causes cancer, but the expense, the cost of removing it, would basically make the price of gasoline, it's already approaching $5, and make it $25 a gallon. So they just leave it in and they put a warning label. Just know there is a chemical in there that can cause cancer. Now, because we're starting to learn this rule that carbon atoms, wherever we have them, and they tend to form long chains or branching chains or rings, since they always follow this rule of having 4 lines coming off them, and usually the most common other chemical that's attached to carbon, if it's not a carbon, is hydrogen, that we try to find shortcut ways of drawing it without having to draw every single atom. So in fact, benzene is commonly depicted just like this, which almost looks like a hex nut. All right? It's understood that this is an organic compound, and at each point is a carbon atom, and that there are hydrogens attached. And there has to be enough hydrogens so that there's a total of 4 lines coming off each carbon. It's just understood. So we're going to see increasingly, instead of drawing out every single atom, they use little symbols to represent that organic compound. Now, there are a whole bunch of aromatic hydrocarbons that look like benzene. So here are some others. You'll notice, in this case, these were drawn looking like this. Everybody see that? They left out drawing all the carbons. It's understood that it looks this way. The only thing that they added is how this chemical differs from benzene. This is called phenol, and it has an OH. Now, didn't we just learn that anything that has an OH attached to it is an alcohol? So this phenol, which is kind of named like similarly to methanol or ethanol, or and so on, is called phenol, ending with an OL. And so that's an alcohol. It's actually used as an antiseptic. You'd say it's used as an antiseptic. In fact, it was the very first antiseptic ever used. It was actually the active ingredient in Listerine. You've all heard of Listerine mouthwash. It's used as an antiseptic. And it was created by Joseph Lister. And it's basically phenol, which is an antiseptic. And so it's found in a number of antiseptics. It doesn't cause cancer, but again, it obviously, when we say it's an antiseptic, it does kill bad guys. It kills bacteria and so on. Now, I'm not asking you to memorize the structure of any of these or the names. I'm just giving you some examples of the organic compounds, or what organic chemicals can look like. Toluene and xylene are similar to phenol, similar to benzene, and they are the chemicals that make up paint thinner. And of course, everybody knows if you use paint thinner or turpentine, it has a smell. These are called aromatic hydrocarbons. They typically have a smell. Now here's another one I'm just mentioning. This is called styrene. I'm not asking you to memorize it. Styrene looks like this. Interestingly, if you join a bunch of styrenes together, all that I did is, if this is one styrene, I just drew three styrenes together. When you connect, when you join a whole bunch of styrenes together, that's called polystyrene. Poly means many, and it's sold under the brand name Styrofoam. So all plastics are made from organic molecules. So the desktop that you're writing on is made out of plastic. I know it looks like wood. That's not wood. That's a plastic material. It's an organic compound. So increasingly, everything is organic. So not only are organic compounds the chemicals that make up living things that we're going to be focusing on this class, but all plastics are hydrocarbon organic compounds. So in the modern world of chemistry, organic chemistry is where all the action is. Again, as I pointed out, they've kind of more or less studied all the possible combinations of all the different elements. What they're really studying is the infinite number of chemicals or molecules you can create based on carbon and hydrogen. And there's an infinite number. It's just amazing. All right, now, at the bottom of the page, you'll notice that all of these chemicals that are drawn at the bottom just look like two or more benzenes joined together. Right? At the top of the page, we showed you what benzene is. All right? So these just look like two or more benzenes joined together. Now, we said benzene does cause cancer. And so if you've got 2 or 3 or more benzenes joined together, they still cause cancer. All of these cause cancer. Now, I'm not asking you to memorize the structure. Just know that benzene causes cancer, and multiple benzenes joined together cause cancer. But I want to tell you something else about them. Some of these, especially this one, benzopyrene, which looks like about 5 benzenes joined together, we wrote that it's formed whenever you burn or char something from a living thing. And you might say, what? Okay, so let me give you a couple of examples. A leaf. It could be a tobacco leaf. It could be a leaf from any plant. Is that from a living thing? Yeah. Yes. It's got organic chemicals in it. When you burn or char anything from a living thing, like a leaf, you'd say, could it be an animal? I'll come to an animal. Yes. Anything that was alive. When you burn or char it, it forms some of these cancer-causing chemicals, especially benzopyrene. So if you've got tobacco leaves and you catch them on fire by lighting the cigarette, it forms benzopyrene, a carcinogen. So that's why tobacco, smoking it, causes cancer. Does everybody follow that? So then there's always somebody who asks me, what about marijuana? Well, is that from a leaf? Yes. So if you burn it, it also forms benzopyrene, a carcinogen. Now in some ways, it's better, in some ways it's worse. Most people, if they're going to smoke a joint, I remember one, they're usually just smoking one or two, and some people, however, don't just smoke one cigarette, they may smoke an entire pack of cigarette, they may be chain smokers. So obviously if you smoke more, you're inhaling more of the benzopyrene. On the other hand, what makes the marijuana a little bit worse is that most cigarettes today are sold with a filter on the end where you put it in your mouth, an activated charcoal filter to try to capture some of that benzopyrene and other carcinogens. People smoking joints, they don't have a filter at the end. So that means whatever benzopyrene is formed, these cancer-causing chemicals, all of it is inhaled. All right? Now, look, let's go a little further. We said anything from a living thing that you burn or char. What about hamburger or steak? Are they from a living thing? Yes. So when you burn or char it, that forms benzopyrene. Has anybody ever heard that charred food has cancer-causing chemicals? That's what they're talking about. Now, not everything that we eat do we char or burn. If you had, a boiled chicken, or something boiled, something like chicken soup, there's no char on it. It's not burnt. It's the char. That char is actually some of the organic compounds having turned partly to cancer-causing chemicals. So let's make something clear, though. And so the question is, so what do you mean? I shouldn't have, barbecued hamburgers anymore? I love barbecued hamburgers. All right. So let's make something clear. If you smoked one cigarette in your entire life, are you going to, in all probability, die from lung cancer? No. Absolutely, almost 100% probability, no. What if you, and I'm not advocating this, but what if you smoke one cigarette each month? So over a year, you'll smoke 12 cigarettes. Have you really significantly increased your risk of dying from lung cancer? No. One cigarette a month doesn't give you lung cancer. Now let's go to the other extreme. What if you're smoking a couple of boxes a day? Yes. In other words, it's not an issue that you're exposed to a cancer-causing chemical, it's how frequently you're exposed. That's the factor. So now, going back to the idea that charbroiled meats do cause cancer-causing chemicals. Yes, they do. Does that mean because you occasionally have, charbroiled hamburgers and steaks and barbecue that you're going to die from cancer of your intestine or something? Not in any real significant probability. However, having said that, I would not recommend having charbroiled food 3 times a day. All right, because that's increasing your frequency of exposure. Does that help clarify this? It's not that you did it once and for sure now you're going to get cancer. It has to do with how frequently your body is exposed to these cancer-causing chemicals. Our body has the capacity to heal and fix itself when occasionally exposed to harmful things. But we can't repeatedly be exposed to harmful things without it taking its toll on our body. All right? Okay, so now that we've covered that, let's go back to C4. And back on C4, so we have been learning about, on page C4, the specialness of a carbon atom. Incidentally, I'll remind you that we've mentioned that there's only one other atom that's similar to carbon in its unique properties, and that's silicon, of which all of our computers are based. It also shares electrons, just like carbon. It's in column 4, just like carbon is on the periodic chart. Remember that when I say that. Remember, here's column 4, carbon and silicon. So the atom or element that's most like carbon is the one that we build our computers out of. But anyhow, we've talked about the science fiction aspect of that. But anyhow, we've talked about how these carbon atoms are like tinker toys. You can build them just like putting blocks together. The only rule you have to follow is you always have 4 sticks sticking out of each carbon atom that have to be linked to other atoms, other carbons, hydrogens, or other atoms. And you can form chains, branching chains, rings, and so on with these organic molecules. So you can shape them in all kinds of, an infinite number of shapes and sizes. Again, just like we're showing here. We've talked about what aromatic hydrocarbon compounds like benzene, and we know that not everything that's an aromatic hydrocarbon is carcinogenic, but benzene, or anytime you have multiple benzenes joined together, they all are cause cancer. We've talked about what an alcohol is. There's not just one kind of alcohol, there's an infinite number of alcohols. Anytime you have an OH attached to a hydrocarbon organic molecule, that's called an alcohol. Now, we have now completed our second year of chemistry, organic chemistry. We kind of shortchanged it a little bit. All right? So we've covered general chemistry, where we talked about the structure of an atom, talked about different bonding between atoms, ionic bonds, covalent bonds. We talked about unequal sharing of electrons or polar covalent bonds. We talked about water molecules and so on. We've now covered organic chemistry. We've given you a sense of what alcohols are and aromatic hydrocarbons. We're now ready for biochemistry. Biochemistry. We've gone from general chemistry to organic chemistry to biochemistry. We're on the bottom of C4. Biochemistry is the chemicals in living things. And we wrote at the bottom of C4 that there are 4 major families of biologically important organic compounds. You've all heard the names: carbs, fats, proteins, and nucleic acids. These are the organic compounds or hydrocarbon compounds that make up living things. So we had to cover this chemistry in order to get into biological chemistry or biochemistry. So we now move to page D1.
DB1?
D1. Okay, so on page D1, it says biological or organic compounds or biochemistry. All right, so we're now going to begin talking about carbs, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Starting with carbs, what are they? Now, page D1 will be included on our test on Wednesday, and I guess we'll have the test on Wednesday. Because nobody has had any questions. So, so what are carbs? Sugars. They are sugars. Carbohydrates are sugars. Now, so we use those terms interchangeably. What kinds of atoms make up sugars or carbohydrates? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. In other words, it's a hydrocarbon compound, but it's got oxygen as well. Now, we divide carbs into 3 subgroups: monosaccharides, right, letter B, disaccharides, letter C, and on the next page at the top, polysaccharides, which won't be on this test. All right? So let's just cover the monosaccharides and disaccharides. So monosaccharides, what are they? Mono means single, one or single. Saccharide means sugars. So these are single sugars or simple sugars. Now some of these simple sugars are just 5 carbon atoms long. And there are many of them, but I'm just going to give you 2 to know. Ribose and deoxyribose. These are 2 sugars that are found in nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. In fact, how DNA and RNA get their name, and we'll learn this later, is DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, because it's got deoxyribose sugar in it, and RNA stands for ribonucleic acid, because it has the ribose sugar. We'll learn more about that. But these sugars are in DNA and RNA. There's also sugars that are 6 carbon atoms long. There are not just 3, there are hundreds of them, but I've listed 3 that we're going to ask you to know. Glucose, fructose, and galactose. The importance of these 3 sugars is all 3 of them are used as a source of energy by living things. Remember, all organic compounds are high in energy. Now, interestingly, first I want to point out, you'll notice a pattern in naming sugars or carbohydrates. What do you notice about their names? OSE. There are some exceptions, but in most cases, carbohydrates or sugars are named so that they end in OSE, O-S-E. Now, glucose, fructose, and galactose, all three of them have the same molecular formula. All three of them contain 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. So in other words, all three of them have the same number and types of atoms. So then that raises the question, well, wait a second. If all three of them contain 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens, how come they have 3 different names? And the answer is, even though they have the same number and types of atoms, they're not arranged in the same pattern. Let's look on page, let's see, I guess it's not the right page here. Page D9, page D9. We wrote that right here. It says see page D9. So on page D9, okay, this is page D9. Okay, and on page D9, these are, what it's showing at the top are simple sugars, or monosaccharides. Monosaccharides means single or simple sugars. Now, this is ribose and deoxyribose. Let's just focus on those two for a moment. Now, I think you can see why we taught you a little bit of chemistry and then organic chemistry before coming here. Clearly, we're now talking about sugars. Everybody appreciates that in a biology class you would learn about sugar. But I don't think you'd understand what we've drawn here if we hadn't learned anything before about chemicals. So first thing, what do we notice? Carbon atoms, a chain of carbon atoms. Everybody see that? And we know the pattern coming off every carbon atom are 4 lines, right? So that's how we recognize it. This is a ribose sugar. It's 5 carbon atoms long. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 carbon atoms long. All right, now I'm not asking you to memorize the structure. Remember, our test is multiple choice. You don't have to draw a picture on a blank sheet of paper, but you should recognize that it's an organic molecule. It's carbon and hydrogen, and so on.